Welcome back, venturers. It's time for another discussion about VNs. I am MR, and I'm joined by my co-host Tauros, as well as the grand tutorialist, master of Renpai himself, Vimi. Welcome back to the podcast.
Hi, thanks. Nice to be back.
So yes, Vini, go ahead and give everyone a little self-introduction about who you are and what you've been involved in.
Sure. So I'm Vimi, real name Matthew Vimislick. I've been a game dev for about 12 years now. Mostly make stuff for children's games, but I've been kind of a little bit more well-known over the past half decade making visual novels. So I've made King of the Cul-de-Sac, which is one of the games referred to on the Renpai homepage. I do a lot of cool stuff there. Won a couple of little prizes for some game jams for visual novels, and I also run a YouTube channel called Visual Novel Design, where I think I'm at 27,000 subscribers right now. Just giving off tons of tutorials for Renpai, how to make visual novels for game devs, and I've been recognized all over the world, I can say now, for that channel.
Yo, impressive! Congratulations on all the success.
Congrats.
And in this case, though, can you explain to everyone just, suppose the basics of what is visual novel publishing? The development side, of course, you're very familiar with, the whole creating it. But when it comes to publishing, what is that?
Sure. So publishing is really just the act of actually putting your game out there. From, I guess, modern days nowadays, you think about it in terms of you press the publish button on Steam, and that's what publishing is. But way back in the day, it was, how do you actually distribute your game to other people? You want a publisher to manage that. Publishers for larger companies, they're the ones that actually fund development of the games because they want to make sure they have stuff that works well for their catalog, or they have deals with other groups where they can get some additional funding for your game. Often, because the publishers handle so many different games, they can also handle a lot of other things that might be a little bit more expensive for a single developer to do on their own. So a lot of this stuff involves translating and localizing your game for other territories. It can involve, oh god, now I'm forgetting the term, porting. So, you make your game, it doesn't just work for PC, it also works for PlayStation, Nintendo, Switch, it works for Xbox, PlayStation, all that sort of stuff. They also handle a lot of the marketing, which, again, I was mentioning earlier. Rami Ismail just did a little tweet earlier saying, hey, if a publisher only wants to handle the marketing, they're not going to be putting in all the effort for you, because publishers have to handle all those other elements there. But for most visual novel developers, I will say, self-publish. Just, it's not going to be worth it running through a bigger company, not for a bit for you, probably.
And so you mentioned distributing the game, and, decades ago, in the older, time period, that would involve physical copies, whether it's finding storefronts who will put your game on shelves, or maybe perhaps mail orders. But nowadays, with the advent of the internet and socials and all of that, digital distribution is also a very important part of publishing, or self-publishing, right?
Yes.
And to get to that, one of the biggest platforms around is Steam. And Steam has its own unique restrictions and guidelines for what it allows, especially with visual novels. We've seen some of these problems before in the past with titles and the ebb and flow of what's been allowed and what's not. And that's been its own huge can of worms, hasn't it?
Yeah, but it's also kind of a side result of a lot of their automated processing for getting things up on their platform. Way back in the day, and I talked to the guy who actually used to do this a bit ago. A lot of the platform, I guess you wouldn't say platform, but consoles. If you wanted a game on PlayStation, you didn't just send it off and it got sent through some automated system or whatnot. A publisher had to talk to a guy at PlayStation to go, hey, we want our game on PlayStation. And they would have a conversation making sure, like, okay, does this abide by a lot of PlayStation's policies? Is this going to be a game that's like legal for us to distribute? Like, are there going to be any like kind of weird complications? Let's make sure that this properly works with our system. How can we set up like, you know, the beta process just to make sure that like whatever gets released to PlayStation, it actually works? It used to be a very involved process. But now, because of digital distribution and because nowadays people are less concerned about getting like a, you know, perfect game out like on the first shot, because, you know, you can do day one patches. Steam made more and more efforts, first with Steam Greenlight, and now, you know, you can just post whatever game you want on Steam to automate a lot of those processes. Now that's really great because it means they get to put out a lot more games than they used to be able to. Now that they don't have to worry about the physical manpower of it. There's a book I was reading a while ago, The Long Tail, where they were saying one of the benefits of Amazon isn't, you know, Amazon does not make most of its money off of its best sellers. It's making most of its profit off of products that they might only sell like, you know, a few hundred copies of through their store. But there are just so many of those very small, very, you know, niche items that ends up becoming like the big thing that makes them a lot of money. And Steam's kind of at that point now. Like, it's great if like Fallout 5 comes out, they're going to sell a whole bunch of copies, but they also have tens of thousands of other games that might only sell like, you know, 20, 30 copies each. And that's going to, you know, more than encompass whatever gets sold day to day, any of those large sellers. So with that in mind, sorry, did you have a little question right now, or?
Yeah, I have a question, or rather a point to make.
Sure.
With your comparison to Amazon specifically, which is a place to sell pretty much everything, right? In comparison to Steam, which is a platform to sell games. And for the longest time, Steam did not consider the ends games. Do you feel like the floodgates have been opened the moment when Steam Greenlight has been a thing and users at large voted in the ends? And that made Steam reevaluate their stance.
Well, keep in mind, Steam has also tried to open up their platform to other things. Like, I bought an indie game documentary off of Steam. Like, they're selling music, they're selling videos, they're selling movies. VNs are just part of that. Yeah, if anything, they're just selling things that work with their brand. They want to make it so if there is, you know, a game-related thing that you want to buy, you go to Steam. Yes, for Amazon, if you want to get something very specific, you know, sure, go for them. But if Steam can be in a situation where it's like, hey, we're going to have better deals on games, now people won't go to Amazon for that. They'll go to Steam. And that's where a lot of platforms are really trying to make themselves stand out. They're not going to be able to compete with Amazon in terms of like their pure ubiquity. But, you know, if you want to sell a very particular sort of item or a particular category of item, they want to become that one storefront there. But going back to the automated stuff, though, and this does go through with Amazon, too. Once you have these automated systems, now it costs them money every time somebody has to actually look over the process. So if at any stage of the process through this automated thing, somebody like a user or just somebody going through just goes like, hey, something suspicious about that, they are just going to shut that down. Now, for really big companies where they have an ongoing relationship with Steam, usually Steam will go, you know, to them and go like, oh, hey, somebody flagged this, you know, hey, can you just give us some reassurance there? Or in some cases, they might go, hey, this is from a place that we have a long-standing relationship with. We're not going to flag this until we get like a whole bunch of messages about this. But for small developers, they're going to just shut that down quick. So a lot of the stuff that comes up where people are like, you know, hey, this is an inconsistent policy. You know, what does Steam allow or don't allow? Like, for the most part, Steam does not care. it really just comes down to what gets caught up in an automated system and how long are those developers willing to hassle Steam to get themselves recognized. Now, at a certain point, like, a line has to be drawn in the sand, but, you know, I think we talked earlier about Chaos Head Noah. Like, often that line in the sand is one, you know, made out of gold, you know? If they think something on their platform is going to make them money and, you know, make them more money than it's costing them to just kind of deal with the hassle, like, they're going to let it on.
For anyone not aware with Chaos Head Noah, it was planning to be released on Steam until they suddenly got a rejection letter from Steam, from Valve, I suppose, rejecting it, saying that it had content that Valve was not in support of, and so they weren't going to host it. And it took a lot of fan feedback and an online movement to raise awareness about it, and Steam took a very rare step of rescinding that ban, to where now Chaos Head Noah is available for purchase on the Steam storefront. I wanted to ask you, Vimi, about the alternative storefronts, because you mentioned how others will try to pick up on the things that you won't. And there is that sort of scene involved in visual novels. You have places like itch.io, Jast, Dempasoft, other places that are more willing to accept certain types of material in visual novels compared to Steam. But these are alternative. They're much smaller than Steam's huge player base and visibility, and so naturally, that's not ideal situation for a visual novel developer to go to a smaller alternative storefront, right?
So big asterisk on that. For Dempasoft, Jast, I'd even go as far the Epic Store still technically. At this point, a lot of those things have like people that have to give the, you know, stamp of approval on a game to be let through. So again, it's great if you have a finished game, if you have an ongoing relationship with them and you can manage to do that, but, you know, not every game's going to be allowed on those stores, both because, like, you know, they literally don't have the manpower to search over every single game that goes their way. They kind of have to be judicious about it. And, you know, as a developer, it can be very tough to actually, you know, get your game looked at by them. So they're small, not because, like, you know, they're small not because they can't get a lot of this stuff. They're small because they don't have the same automated processes as Steam. And that's both good and bad because, you know, for Jast especially, they're working under a, you know, we were talking earlier about, you know, Steam versus Amazon. You want games, you go to Steam versus you go to Amazon. Well, if you're going for visual novels, like, you know, Jast is one of those sites where you might go, oh, hey, probably that's a better place to go on there. So that's really great if you are a visual novel developer that is making the sort of stuff that Jast sells on their store. And let me explain that one. So there are people who spend a lot of their time literally just analyzing Steam and analyzing what works on that platform. So on Steam, they'll go like, well, what kind of games tend to work best? What sorts of things can we do to our game to make it have more visibility by Steam? What's like the best, you know, amount that, you know, how often should we discount this game? How can we juke the stats so Steam ends up recommending our game more often? You still have to do the same thing with Jast. If you are making a visual novel that is like a gritty tale of, you know, World War II survivors using like actual audio recordings of survivors at the time, that's probably not the best storefront for you on Jast, because no one who's going on there for, you know, their cute harem anime stuff is gonna want that. But on Steam, they might have a shot. So, you know, each of these platforms work well for different situations. Itch.io, for most developers, like small hobbyist developers, that one's a really great service specifically for devs. yes, it doesn't have like anywhere near the foothold as like Jast or Steam does. If you are a casual like consumer who just wants to play a whole bunch of like cool ass games, itch.io is probably not the best place to go. But if you're a developer who wants to put out some experimental games and then find some other developers who make the same sorts of games as you, itch.io is perfect. They have systems in place for game jams. So, if you want to make a particular sort of game, you can, make that sort of game and then see a lot of other developers that are making games similar to yours. They have lots of systems in place to make sure that developers get a hold of each other. It's a really great system for creatives. Not really with consumers in mind, but with developers. So that's the one I usually recommend.
Especially
a very
for any
interesting comparison, because now that we talk about different storefronts, Steam is like a centralized place in which you go for game-related stuff.
Right? Yep.
But due to its stranglehold on that industry, so digital publishing, and inconsistent rules for VNs, Just stepped up and became one of the most recognized alternative for VNs specifically, so a specialized platform.
Yeah.
Now you in comparison show also itch.io, which is more open to wide variety of games, but not necessarily customer centric, but rather developer centric. What's your opinion on GOG, for example? Because this is a similar platform to Steam, and for the longest time they were really reluctant to having VNs, and they tried to distance themselves. But maybe due to Steam inconsistent nature, they, so to speak, smelled the blood and went with a very good brownie points of saying, no. If Steam doesn't want you, we want you, and go GOG open the gates for VNs.
So I think it's important to look at how distribution platforms affect how you have to develop your games to start with. Steam has a stranglehold of the industry not because it's the largest game developer or the largest distribution platform. It has a stranglehold because it's the largest distribution platform, and if you want to do well, you have to do well on their platform, which means often you need to make changes to your game to increase those Steam integrations. Achievements were something that was just like, it was a fun craze for a bit, people are like, oh, add achievements into our game. Now it's just like this sort of fun thing to encourage people to try out some weird stuff in the games. Well, then Steam started integrating their achievements like into the platform, and now your game has to have achievements. Like, that's just free advertising right there, having that achievement system in there. That's just like one way it's affected games. Other things are just like looking at the sorts of games that are oversaturated, or looking at the sorts of games that tend to do well on Steam. Like, you will orient the sorts of games that you develop based off of how well Steam does. Now, that doesn't mean everyone does. It just means like the smart developers who want to make money will do that. Visual novels are actually in a very weird place because visual novels do well on Steam. I think it was Chris Wolf. He's this guy who analyzes a lot of Steam stats and stuff like that. He consistently says, like, if you want to make a game that's going to make money on Steam, like, a visual novel is a pretty good way to go. But you mentioned, like, yes, they have an inconsistent policy on certain things. I don't look at that as an inconsistent policy. I'm looking at it as, what are the sorts of things that Steam responds well to? And what are the sorts of things that causes Steam to recommend your game more often? And those are the types of visual novels that if you want to make money on Steam, you need to produce your game to aim towards. If you have something... Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to respond with, that's a fair point. part of gaming the system is to recognize what works well and what doesn't. But given the fact that it's nowhere it's described completely and coherently, and there is no line drawn in the sand, that means you, in a way, you're gambling on how much you can push the envelope, so to speak, unlike bigger titles such as Witcher or Cyberpunk that gets a free pass just because of its size.
Yeah, and I mean it's very intent. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, and if I just to add a note, what also makes it annoying is that Steam's policies can change at any time. For a while, there was a time where you could have a external patch to include content that Steam wouldn't allow, but as of a while ago, Steam would really crack down on anyone commenting in the community hub or the reviews of the existence of any patches. And so, in a way, that's becoming a gray area, and if you're developing a visual novel with many months, maybe even years of development before you release it, who knows if Steam's going to change their rules to deny something that you thought was acceptable at the time. So there's more risks involved, right?
Yeah, but that's all by design. Nobody who runs a platform wants to be like, they don't want to be rules lawyered by their clients, They don't, you said this was allowed, so I made a game that's all this thing, that's the thing that you said was allowed. If they feel like it's going to negatively impact them in some way. If somebody wanted to, they could very clearly make a case of like, hey, this game has crossed the line into illegal territory. They might say all these characters, like, they aren't really in high school, they're in college, but all the signifiers are like they're in grade school. They can go ahead and do that, but they're not going to be targeting the developer who maybe sold like 12 copies of it, because that guy or girl has no money. They're going to be targeting Steam for being a platform for that sort of thing. And with Steam being the, platform with billions of dollars, they're going to be going for it. Steam does not want to risk being a target of litigation, and they're going to make every attempt they can to hedge their bets to minimize the chances of that sort of thing happening. And that's not unique. Like, itch.io is going to do the same sort of thing. If you have a game that is teetering on illegal content, they're going to, shut that down. A big point of comparison, and I think it's worth thinking about, especially with visual novels because of the strong connection with Japan, is Japan is incredibly tolerant of certain things, and for a while intolerant of others. If you wanted to push the envelope onto the stuff that is barely illegal, yes, you would be hard pressed to get that sold in stores. But historically, a lot of visual novels were not made to be distributed directly in stores that marketed towards the masses. They were made by hobbyist groups. I was watching 16-Bit Sensation because great source of B-roll for me anyway. But they go over a lot of the history of visual novel development, and I think a really good thing to point out is the company that was making the visual novels in this anime, they were very explicitly a hobbyist group. The owner of the thing ran a computer store underneath, and the people who were making the visual novels were really just part of a hobbyist group that worked on top of the computer store there. Whenever they were selling stuff, it was through mail order, it was through events like Comiket. They were selling that stuff directly to consumers in venues where they're not really going to be as easily targeted for litigious action. So it paid for them to kind of push the envelope a little bit, because when you're competing for space, when you're competing to try to get some very dedicated fans, it benefits you to do some stuff to kind of set yourself apart from the crowd. But once you go into a managed space where all of a sudden that space needs to maintain not just legal standards but also brand standards, that's where heads are gonna butt up against each other.
Hmm. Especially when you go from the small hobby sphere where it's safe to assume a primary motivation is just for the joy of the craft. And then you try to go from that into perhaps storefronts where places like Steam or itch.io are trying to make money, and they're trying to make lots of money. And if one title is going to risk themselves with the possibility of lawsuits or, being sued, obviously they're going to pick the side where they get to keep all their money. And so, like you mentioned, with like the mail orders and the conventions, those are places where there's far less risk of that litigation, and they can fly under the radar, and their fans can be happy, and it's great for everyone involved. Except, once the priorities change, when money is the front and foremost issue, then that's where things start getting a little dicey.
Yeah.
That's very good. Especially in the case of that one visual novel that was in the news a while back, Order Us. That's right. Order Us. How they were something like 3 days away from being published on Steam, and suddenly it was reviewed and rejected, and Steam wasn't going to host them anymore. And it caused a big uproar over on social media sites with people questioning what was so wrong about this title. And I wanted to mention that because I think later they also tried going to itch.io, and itch also rejected them for similar vague reasons. And so thankfully they're available on other storefronts, but again, it really highlights the differences. And how you mentioned how it's somewhat by design of how they want to keep their rules a little bit vague so that they can protect themselves in the future. Obviously, It sucks to hear for fans, for the individual developers themselves. It's an unfortunate reality, though, of some of the problems involving visual novels.
And it's something where I have seen other communities actually do pretty well. If something that we recommend for a lot of people marketing is to not solely depend on things like Steam, on Facebook, on Twitter as the way to kind of spread the message of your game out. Like, you want to directly talk to your fans as soon as possible. Having a newsletter actually has like a better rate of return than like almost anything else. Like, it's better than ads. It's better than having stuff recommended to you on social media. If you just email them directly going like, hey, remember when you said you were interested in this game? Well, it's out. Here's this little newsletter email thing. Like, that's the most effective way to do that. Likewise, with a lot of people setting up Discords, like there's a bit of an astroturfing element of it where like every company wants to set up their, own little communities. They want to, maintain their brands through a careful curation of a community where they have the sole power over it. There are some communities, and I will say it's the furry community, definitely. They're the best about it. Where it's just like communities of people with mutual interests, and they are very supportive of each other's creative efforts. They want, if one of them makes a game, if they make art, if, do whatever, making their costumes or whatever, like they want to be supportive of each other. If you're able to add to that creative effort by making your own stuff, great. If you're able to monetarily contribute by like buying products from each other, great. Or if you don't have any money and you just want to say like, hey, great job, great. The community's there to like help support and, kind of hold each other up. I've been reading this book by Brendan Koff, I think it is. The Video Game Industry Does Not Exist, where they explicitly go into like the reasons why people go into game development in the first place. Because there's this big idea of like, oh, if you're a hobbyist just making fun little like 5-minute games, like you're not really part of the video game industry. And in this book, like they're making the point that like historically people making those silly little games, the creator of like Super Meat Boy, he was just making those cute little games, those little flash games. Then he just like one of them ended up being pretty successful. He made it a standalone game, and all of a sudden like he's had like a few like major hits on his hand. He's always been part of the game industry is the argument. even though like he may not have considered himself a part of it when he was just making those little games. Likewise, if you're in a community and you want to make a visual novel that appeals to that community, like go for it. That's like a great motivator for you making creative works. Successful creative works is just to be part of a community, create stuff to enrich that community, and if you are just an equitable member of that community, like your efforts are going to be rewarded, if not monetarily, at least like socially. And if the game that you make is popular enough, like you'll get some cultural rewards as well.
Very cool. Very
I gotta
cool.
say,
That's all been a very
I gotta say,
interesting look.
I didn't anticipate this conversation will turn into the likes of Edmund Macmillan and his works in Super Meat Boy and Binding of Isaac later down the line. But I do have a question to you, Vimi, then.
Sure. Last question.
Yeah. For those developers that tried to play into the Steam game, but they didn't succeed. So, for example, in Order Us situation, what would you say is the plan B in those cases? Or is it just as simple as only plan A and make it or break it?
So that's a tough thing, because if you are making a game solely for profit, then you should be building your game like around a very set plan. With Order Us, I can imagine if they've seen historically Steam had some issues with those sorts of things. Just me personally, I would probably say like Steam would be a nice to have, but plan A should be going to some of those alternative storefronts, talking to those publishers directly, trying to arrange any deals I can with them, and then treat Steam as an afterthought. Like if Steam accepts the game, great. If not, okay, well, let's look at creating an alternative Steam version. Like, if they feel like that's economically viable for them, which it looks like they're using Live 2D. You could probably just make a separate skin for Steam. That might also involve like maybe talking to some of those alternative publishers and saying like, hey, we won't do a Steam like we won't sell on other storefronts for like a year, but that maybe kind of give us a little bit more money. But on a hobbyist level, like if you're just making games for fun and you want other people to check them out, again, go to itch.io. If you don't have a specific game in mind, you just want to make interesting stuff, like do game jams. They're going to have very set rules about what is and is not acceptable usually. So that's a lot easier to like play ball and make sure that, you can work with that community to make a game that, other people will enjoy. But yeah, often like if you just are like, I'm going to make this game, this is the game I want to make, full steam ahead. I'm not going to, look outside of, this very narrow idea of the game that I want. You're kind of setting yourself up for some trouble.
I mean, makes sense. It's interesting that. I mean, it's kind of saddening the reality that you say you should treat a Steam as a plan B and set yourself to plan A of different kind. Fair enough, but maybe that's the solution. Okay? So thank you very much for that. And with that, we are reached at the ending of that. Thank you very much for joining us today, and thanks
for having me.
to all our listeners.
Yes, thank you so much, Vimi.
All right. Have a good one.
Yes, and thank you
Thank
to
you,
all our listeners tuning in for the episode. I hope you all enjoyed. Everyone, venture out.
Venture out.